Welcome, and I am so excited today to bring Christina Booth to you. So welcome, Christina.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And your accent is different. So you must be like on the other side of the world from where we are.
Yes, I'm upside down to you, and I live on a heart-shaped island at the bottom of Australia called Tasmania.
Right. And everybody here immediately has an image of a Tasmanian devil from Looney Tunes in their head, which
Yes.
does bear some very, very distant relation to where you are. But we're not here to talk about the Tasmanian devil. We're here to talk about another creature, mammal, that
Yes.
is around the waters. So tell us a little bit about
Yes.
your new book, Welcome Home Wales.
So Welcome Home Wales is actually set in the city that I live in, called Hobart. And it's the story about a boy and a whale. And the boy hears these stories, and nobody else can hear them. And the stories are coming from a whale that is swimming down the River Derwent, which I can see out my window. It's a very wide and beautiful river, and we have now quite a few whales that swim into it.
Wow.
But at that time in 2010, it's based on a true event. The boy wasn't a part of that true event, but the whales swam into the river and had the first calf that had been born there, or known to be born there, in nearly 200 years. So the story is the boy learning the story of this whale and its history, and learning about whaling and the effects that it has on communities and on environments, and especially on species.
And you've got a copy of the book behind you. I can see one. Do you have one closer?
Yes.
You can show us the cover.
Yes, so I've got one here. Now, this is a different cover to the one that's coming out in America and Canada, and it's called Welcome Home in Australia. In Canada and America, it's called Welcome Home Wales, and your cover will look a little different as well.
So beautiful. And you're both the author and the illustrator for this.
I am, yes.
It's amazing. I was reading in your biography that you train as both a teacher and a landscape artist. Seems destined for you to be an author.
Yes.
So, yeah, how cool is it to be able to use both of those skill sets in such a gorgeous, enriching way? Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to children's books and how your history there?
As a child, I cuddled books in bed instead of soft toys, and I was one of the lucky children on the planet that had the opportunity to learn to read, and to learn to read very early. And I was reading before I went to school, and so reading took me to everywhere I needed to go. I realized that reading was something that opened doors to me that other people probably couldn't open for me. And so I loved reading. I've loved words, and I especially have loved imagery, because I've always loved doing art. And my parents and friends and family all knew that I would be destined to do something with art, not necessarily with words. And so eventually I studied to be an art teacher, and I studied to teach art to kinder kids right through to pre-university students. And so I did that for a few years, but I had this huge longing to illustrate books. And so one day I had that opportunity, and I've broken into that, and I love it. And then somebody encouraged me, which is what we always need, to maybe have a go at working with words. And I've always loved working with words, but I didn't have enough confidence to believe that I could write something that would go in a book. And so, ironically, that we were just talking about that, my very first book that I wrote was actually about Tasmanian devils. And so I wrote that book and took it into a publisher, and thinking that hopefully they would like my illustrations and would get me to illustrate someone else's book, but they loved my words as well. So that was my very first picture book. So it was very, very exciting. And I love working with visual narrative, and I love working with text. And it's something that when you're doing both together, it just seems to be a very natural evolution. And it one sometimes comes before the other, or sometimes it switches around. And it's just a very nice and complete way to work. And I feel very blessed to be able to do both.
That's amazing. As I was looking at the book, about how organic the words and art go together. And since you are both, but so much of the story is told explicitly through the art. The history of whaling is told through the art. You do have some fantastic back matter. Love that. Thank you for
Thank you.
but the artist just communicates so much, almost narrative information that, well, it is narrative, not almost, it is narrative information that is important for the reader. And I also love the fact that the whale takes her time telling the story.
Yes.
Yes, and that we always want to hurry. And if nothing else, the pandemic has taught us how to pause.
Yes, it has. I hope we remember that lesson. I hope that we all remember that amidst all the chaos and that the hardship that it's created for us, because we're not good at dealing with change, especially in such a hurry, that that time and thinking and absorbing and taking time to just take in your surroundings and breathe and not feel like you have to keep going is something that's really beneficial to us. I always say to students when we're doing writing, is that when you're working on your words and you're thinking things through, you know, if you want to spend the whole lesson sitting with your head on the desk thinking, please do it, because that's one of the most important parts of creating words and ideas for stories. And it's probably 90% of the building of stories, and then the rest is just popping it down on paper and jigsawing it all back together again. But yes, and the whale, as she tells that story, it's a hard history. It's not a nice story. And so using the visual narrative to talk about that whaling was very important to me, because it's a gentle way to do it. It's a safe way to do it. And I feel that books, especially for children, are a safe way to talk about not nice things. And whaling certainly isn't. And I'd wanted to write a book about that involved whaling for many, many years, but knew that I had to be careful that it wasn't a platform to preach, and that it also wasn't something that was gruesome and horrific, because it would be for children. And so when I heard the story of this whale had swum up into the river and had this calf, and that the reason that they hadn't been in the river for that 200 years, because stories always come from questions, I asked myself, why did this whale go away? Why did these whales go away from this area? And why did this whale come back? And so I did all my research and discovered the extreme whaling that happened once this area was settled by European arrivals, and how it took 200 years for a whale to feel safe enough to come back into the river. And then I asked myself, how did the whale know it was safe, and how did they know it was unsafe? Do whales tell stories to their children in the way that we tell stories to ours? And that's a question obviously we can't answer, but I would like to think so.
Well, whale song, I mean, maybe they sing the story.
Yes.
Who knows?
And that's another part too, is that I actually wrote this story with the whale singing the story to the boy. And as I was writing it, I was also reading the story or doing my research about southern right whales in particular, and discovered they're the only whale that doesn't sing. And I thought, oh no, I've written this story about a singing whale. What do I do now? So I decided that it would tell the story. And that worked. Yes, they moo, they don't sing. It was very unfortunate. But
that's so interesting. I've learned something new. I've learned many new things, but that is amazing. I never knew that whales moo. So next time when somebody says what goes moo, I'm going to say whale. Southern right.
The southern right whale. Yes. Yeah. All the northern right whales do them as well.
Do they do moo? Okay, good.
Yeah. So they're almost identical species. The only thing that separates them is the equator. They can't swim across the equator because the water's too warm. So we have a northern species and a southern species.
So interesting. So yeah, and I do want to talk a little bit about your illustrations, just because, yes, we talk about the fact that you communicate a lot in them, but they are so lovely. I just swim in them because they look like they'd be warm and inviting, and not too warm, not equator warm, more warm. But tell us a little bit about how you came with the style of illustrations for this particular book.
Okay, because I'm spoiled enough to have been trained as an art teacher, I've got access to a lot of materials. So I do change my materials around depending on what I'm illustrating. And for this one, I did use watercolor because it was based in water. So that seemed to be the best thing to do. I used quite a coarse paper because I wanted it to have that windy, sandy feel to it as well. And I used salt, because salt is fantastic to work with on watercolor, because you sit it on the paper, and I don't know if you can probably see it on the front cover if I bring it nice and close. These speckles, some of them are from sitting salt on the paint, and then you let it dry and it absorbs in some of the pigment and changes the way it dries on the paper. Then you remove that, and then I've sprayed a little bit of white over the top as well. But it just gives this beautiful texture, and I just thought, well, it correlates with the fact that our river is a saltwater river, and obviously because whales swim in it. So that's the mediums that I use. I also used wax to create the callosities that are on whales, and place that in first so that it absorbed some of that pigment where there were little gaps, but so that it actually gave it almost that three-dimensional rough look. And so that's how I created it, and it was a lot of fun to create, actually. Yes.
It looks like it, and that was such an interesting fact that the callosities is like a fingerprint for whales.
Yes, it is. They're born with them, and the reason that they end up looking so gnarly and chunky is because other creatures come in to live in the callosities, and then they sort of swim with the whales and help keep them clean. But the actual markings they're born with.
So symbiotic relationship going on there. That's cool. So as an art teacher, you probably have lots of ideas of ways that teachers could use this book with students, with kids in the classroom, or even librarians. So what are some things that you can see them doing that would be really cool to do with this book?
Well, I think to start off with, a very basic thing is just playing with watercolor and learning how it works, because you can make amazing artwork just with experimenting with watercolors and putting things in it like salt, or leaving a seed or some other object on it while it dries and then removing it, and learning how it works, because watercolor is one of those mediums that we tend to use like other paint if we haven't been trained how to use it, and it's actually meant to be very watery, and you add layers to it, and sometimes mistakes that we make with it that damage the surface end up being something wonderful. And when you learn what it does, you can then use it in other ways. But just creating little abstract artworks on little pieces of paper is one way to start. Another one is to I suppose you can look at how colours represent different things. So the colours that I've used in this book are reasonably muted if they're on the sand or on the water, and how you can use strong colours for land, and taking a view from above, so a bird's eye view, imagining what would it look like if I was a seagull, and how would I see the world, and how would I draw that? And it's a really interesting thing for kids to play with, because kids, once they reach a certain age, will start to get really hung up about things being very accurate. But when you move them out of an area that they don't know much about, they lose those inhibitions. So having different perspectives and different ways of looking at things are really good too. As I said, I worked with wax, so learning to just create a drawing with wax and then overpainting, which is something we've done for years with kids, but it is a lot of fun, and seeing what you can do with that. Also, wax crayons are really great. So you've got the colour and you can see what you're doing. Spray bottles and yeah, just lots. I think with this one, experimentation. I have seen a class do collage using tissue papers, and they're quite fun, and they actually go really strange when you get the tissue paper wet. But if you spray it, or do it on purpose, you can create these amazing visual textures in tissue paper, because the dye in it runs and then it bleeds out, and you can have a lot of fun making it run onto paper, or just getting those little textures on the paper as you spray it. You can crunch it up, and just doing a lot of collage things with either an image behind it or creating an image using that.
It also occurs to me that you can invite kids to look at the animals they're endangering where they live, or may have lived where they are but no longer do, and what kind of story those creatures might be telling them if they listened hard enough.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And every picture tells a story, and so and even with words. Yep, even with words, playing with that and building the two together, and looking at environments and building environments out of recycled materials, and it's an endless thing that we can do with creativity with any topic, but especially when you're dealing with water and animals and whales and sea creatures and things like that. Yes.
Well, Christina Booth, thank you so much, and thank you, Blue Dot Kids Press, for bringing us together today. And we're spending a little bit of time with us as we talk about Welcome Home Wales and this beautiful new book, which will be available here in the United States, I think, in April. So
yes,
we're looking forward to having that here, and this is a great,
very exciting
taste to have beforehand. So thanks so much for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
And have a great day. And
you too.